All right, great. Looking forward to it. Rob, been such a pleasure getting to know you. And I really love your perspective on things. We're going to cover a lot of topics today, from the how do we win students back? How does technology play a role in that? You have some really interesting philosophies, and I would say refreshing philosophies when it comes to using data and analytics to empower and use it as a carrot rather than a stick. And really excited to dive in. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off first with kind of a framing up for folks because your background is different. For the last couple of decades, you were actually working on the database infrastructure side of things and managing IT networks before coming into the facilities world, where normally folks come up through the trades and the facilities side of things. And I wanted to know, how does that kind of analytical IT approach kind of shape your view and perspective as you're thinking about viewing school facilities and buildings?
So whenever I was in IT, what I figured out early on, and I think everybody in IT figures it out, is that the way you get operational optimization is through automations, right? You're creating, you're scripting, you are doing things that will allow you to essentially never touch this project again. It will just run on its own, when the appropriate triggers happen. And that informed me in building this kind of systems-based mindset. And so when I look at problems, whether it's in IT or facilities management or at home or whatever, I'm looking for, the root cause, and I'm looking for how do we make this system so that it requires the least number of human touches and inputs. Um, and that's just a way to try to gain that efficiency. And so when I came to facilities, I always like to share the story that I was sitting in my office one day, and my boss's boss showed up, and she said that I need a facilities director in 2 weeks, and that you can either go willingly or I can reassign you. And I took the pay bump and went ahead and moved over. Um, and when I got here, what I realized is that I just enjoyed solving, IT wasn't about the IT, it wasn't about the technology, it was about solving problems. And it was about keeping that focus on providing that support for the classroom and the kids. And so getting to facilities and then seeing that we were essentially blind. I was used to having a dashboard. So if the power went out anywhere in town, I would know, I'd be one of the first people to know because my battery backups would send alerts and those types of things. And then, I go to look at our HVAC system, and we have a few points of data here and there, but we just didn't, you were just blind. We just didn't know. And that was the first thing that I started building out, because you can't have, I- you can't expect good outcomes when the roof doesn't hold the outside out. And every time it rains, it's raining inside the building. And then when you're chasing, we have about 1,000 air conditioners in the school district. And, um, when you're chasing constant and continual air conditioning problems that are just a surprise every single time. So it's one of those things about building out the ability to have the vision and see the problem ahead of time. Because if it's up to me, my preference would be to have, somebody reports an air conditioner is broken, and I say, "Yep, I already knew it was broken. It broke at this exact time. It's got to be one of these three things. We've already dispatched a person to it, or we've assigned that work to the appropriate person."
I love that. And it's interesting how you bring up kind of tangentially the idea of using a vision to help you prioritize, right? The pre-planning and how do we set not the right systems in place so that we're rigid, but so that we can effectively answer things in the most pressing priority, especially when mistakes come up. Um, you know, how do you think about prioritization when you're in that problem solving area and trying to solve these really big issues?
So the first thing that I always look at is the student impact, right? So it's if an entire building doesn't have water, that means we don't have school. So that goes to, and I prioritize things, it's backwards from what most people do. That's a priority zero. That means there's nothing else in existence right now except fixing that water problem for me because I don't want to send between 600 and 1,700 kids home um, to potentially not receive the appropriate meals that, it depends on what level of poverty you're dealing with in those types of situations. But, sometimes school really is the best place for them to be. So, I always start with, how does it affect the kids in the classroom first? That's tough sometimes because we have like if an air conditioner goes out last year at our old high school building, we had a problem with a chiller and the dampeners and whatnot. So we had classrooms that were 60 degrees and classrooms that were 80 degrees. And we're tearing the school down, and it was, I think it was going to be a $400,000 fix. And so you just can't solve that problem for 2 months. It just economics doesn't work. But there's some level of suffering that I hate to say was necessary in that point, but operationally it didn't make any sense. So there's always that piece, and it's how it affects the kids in the classroom and the learning environment. That's the start. The next piece is there's always, and I feel like it's important to acknowledge reality in everything that I do. There's always a political component too, right? So if the superintendent or the CFO or my supervisor, uh, if they have an issue with the lights in their office, we're probably going to prioritize, even though it's one person, their impact on the learning environment is large. They're going to be meeting with people, they're going to be making decisions. We have to kind of lead that in and make sure that we're managing those issues just as well as we are the kids. So it's this balancing act that we're struggling with at all times. And I think that the struggle is appropriate, and I don't expect the struggle to ever go away. Um, yeah, I just don't know. I mean, maybe you could optimize it, but I think there's a human component in there somewhere.
As you described kind of your prioritization matrix, a lot of districts are trying to solve or look for answers for a priority zero when it comes to declining enrollment that impacts budgets and staffing, all of those things. Um, you've done some extensive research in your MBA around trends in Oklahoma and moving a lot of student volume to virtual charters and homeschools and lots of other institutions. From your perspective, how does facilities, custodial, in the physical state of buildings kind of act as a critical marketing piece to help win back some of that enrollment and battle against that project?
This is something that the universities have done a good job of researching whenever it comes to enrollments and their grounds. They say, and I don't remember the exact numbers on it, but it's something like students typically decide which university they're going to attend in a campus visit in the first 5 or 10 minutes. It's not it's not about, the academics. It's not about the people. It's not about the location. What it's about is the outsides of the campus. And so from their perspective, in Oklahoma State University is in my backyard. I'm in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and they have award-winning campuses regularly, big awards too, big national awards. And the reason that they do that is they know that this is valuable. They know that this perception is very real. and they invest in it. So this is one of the priorities that I have at the moment is how do you know, how do you manage the environment, the ecological side of it whenever you're responsible for, in my case, about 325 acres worth of property in what used to be a prairie land with pollinators and all of those types of things in our natural environment and balance that with the maintenance and the cost associated with maintaining these spaces. But also you need to manage the perception because, we passed a bond issue. Fortunately for us, we were able to build a brand new high school. I was able to get deferred maintenance dollars and we're able to kind of move some of these things forward. But most of the people in my community that vote for this bond, they don't set foot in the building. They don't know anything about Stillwater Public Schools except for what they A, read in the newspaper, and B, see when they drive by one of our school buildings. So, how do you manage your grounds for that public perception? So that's what it starts out at the curb. And I look at this kind of as concentric rings of influence. And so the curb is the first one. That's where we get the most traffic, the most people are going to see our space. Then you go to the front door. Is our front entrance of each one of our buildings clean, well taken care of? Do we have weeds growing out of the sidewalks? What does it look like as you're approaching this building? Then, in Stillwater, we have a policy where we have a locked door just for security purposes. So what's that experience like? And then as you continue to move into the building, and this is something that I talk to my custodial staff about a lot, is we're not staffed at a way that we could do everything that we want to do, and we're not funded at a way that we could do everything that we want to do. But what we can do is, especially like our middle school right now, I created a special custodial team just to deal with the floors in the front entryway and the student center, and then kind of down the auxiliary halls a little bit. So we stripped and waxed and refinished, and I want the kids at the middle school to show up and see the ridiculously shiny floors that have been redone properly for the first time in many, many years. Now, they're going to turn around and walk down a hallway, and that hallway is not going to be as nice. But I'm controlling what I can and not trying to shoot for this level of perfection that it's not possible for us to attain at this point. Um, yeah.
It's a really interesting point and one that I want to dive into a little bit later. This view of uh, operational sufficiency and balancing dollars with every other good thing you could be doing rather than achieving a gold standard. But I'm kind of curious, is you've set this direction and vision for making sure in these concentric circles of influence, you're going from the outside in. How do you get administrators, teachers, others on board with that kind of approach and philosophy?
And I'll tell you on this one, this is a continual challenge, right? Especially whenever you have people that don't understand, what a square foot really truly is they can't extrapolate that out in their mind, I'm to the point where I could walk in a building and I can say this is 20, 50, 70, whatever thousands of square feet, I have a pretty good idea of that. Now, so I'm a, talking about my personality a little bit. You know, I guess we'll call back to IT real quick. I realized back in IT that all of my real problems were not technology problems, they were interpersonal problems. And it was about building teams and leading. And so I leaned into the first Patrick Lencioni book that I read was The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And he really pushes on the primary dysfunction is trust. Um, one of his other books is The Six Types of Working Genius. where I found out I didn't know this until this time. I did like, I'm an ENTJ, I'm an Enneagram 5, I'm a, whatever the colors are and all that stuff. But I think the Six Types Working Genius is really solid on this piece is that I'm a wonder and a galvanizer. And so wonder means I love the idea of being able to, see the future. In my head, I have this kind of like knob, this wheel of time, and I can say, what could it look like if? Or if we're in a space where we want to be or don't want to be or whatever, I can turn that same wheel of time backwards and then say, how did we get where we are right now? So those items really come into who I am as a person, right? I'm an IT person, I'm a data person, but also I'm a galvanizer. So the primary thing that I use is I use data. And I want to make sure that, the teachers and the principals and the superintendent, they all understand that we have 1.4 million gross square feet of buildings. We have 325 acres of property. It doesn't, the ground side of it is real easy. We have four full-time staff for maintaining our grounds for 305 acres of a rural but urbanized environment. I don't know how many miles of sidewalk we have, but it's a lot. Um, Whenever it comes to custodial, it's a little bit more difficult to quantify that. So I take these numbers and I try to break them down into chunks so that people can understand. So 1.4 million square feet, if you have a standard of 20,000 square feet per custodian, that math's fairly easy. It's 70 custodians. So then I could tell them, well, 2 years ago, before our big budget cut round hit, we had 60 positions. Okay, now that we're not meeting our own standard, now they cut my positions. I'm down to 51 positions. Now I have 9 vacancies. Then you have, a 10% on a good day, you have a 10% absenteeism rate. So you can just keep chipping away at these numbers, and eventually you come up with a number that's somewhere around 40 custodians supporting these buildings, which is 34,000 square feet per custodian. People still don't really understand what 34,000 square feet is. So then I take that number and I say, okay, what's like a 3 bed, 2 bath house in square foot numbers? That's just a normal average house in my area, something that my teachers would live in. And I would say, okay, well, that's about 12 and a half houses every day that we're expecting this custodian to clean. So are they cleaning all 12 and a half houses in one shift and they're just not doing it very well? Or are they cleaning one piece of that house and they're doing it to a high standard? But we have to acknowledge somewhere in there that it's not possible to clean 12 and a half houses in 8 hours with somebody that's making, below a living wage in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Um, and it's bringing people along so that we can build out this compassion and this understanding for the custodians, because with the teachers are going to be locked in their own mind. They've got students, they've got behavioral issues, they're trying to differentiate their instruction, they're doing all kinds of things to try to influence the best outcomes for their students in their classroom. And then when something's dirty, they don't care about all of the other things that go into it, or our staffing models, or numbers, or any of that stuff. They just know it's dirty and it needs to stop. And so it's trying to build that compassion, because we have to be very human centric. Um, and it's always a struggle, right? I remind people, I ask people, especially in the school world that have an understanding for this, is like, how many how many of my custodians do you think had an individualized education plan or a 504? They were in our special needs program, or they were in a special needs program somewhere. That number is probably going to be greater than the average of other people in these roles. And that's another way that I can speak to the teachers to give them an idea of who these people are that we're working with. Um, and to try to keep it positive and to say, if you go and you are mean to that custodian, they're going to remember that and it's going to affect them negatively and it's not going to go well for the custodian and it's not going to go well for you. You're better off hiding pieces of candy around your classroom and seeing if they can find them all, right? How do we motivate as a group? How do we motivate as a team? How do we look at this as it's all us against the problem? And the problem is, how do we educate kids in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where we're, funded 50th in education, right?
Right.
Um, and I always like to remind people we're not 50th in education in Oklahoma because of me and my role or the teachers in the classroom. We're there because of the state and funding and opportunities and those types of things. Really, the people that are in the buildings are just doing the best job they can.
Right. I love that hiding candy example. I may have to employ that myself. And, they really are all human problems. I think your housing analogy is going to be one that lots of folks on the call today are going to leverage for their own conversations. That was a really powerful reframe and really brings to
So
light this idea as
I,
a, oh, go ahead.
I wanted to add to the housing one real quick is the common pushback whenever you use that one is it'll be somebody that typically it's a teacher that no longer has children in their home. They're empty nesters, and they'll say, "Well, I clean my whole house in 8 hours or in 2 hours. That means that they should be able to do this." And I said, "Do you run 600 kids through your house for 8 hours before you clean it? Because that's what we're doing." So.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's not a museum, right? Like it's a lived in experience space. As a galvanizer, as you frame things in a human way, I know as you talk about implementing data and using data, it's not just to convince administrators, but you're using data as a tool to help support your custodians. You want to give them something to help them stand up for themselves, to fight back, when there are accusations of them not doing their work, for example, or being ungrateful. Um, how does deploying something like scanning QR codes and giving that kind of facility your frontline workers protect them? How do you use that to help galvanize them and um, let them experience things more as a carrot than a stick?
So this is something that I expect to be a little bit of a challenge coming into this year because we're expanding out our implementation of crowd comfort to our entire school district, and I'm super excited about it. But what's going to happen, I think, is that I'm going to have some other principals or leaders that are going to ask for dashboard access because they're going to want to try to lean in and micromanage staff that's not their staff, and they're going to want to tell them what to do and how to do it and to say, well, what were you doing for these 5 minutes or these 15 minutes in between these 2 points or scans or whatever. And so right now I start by being incredibly protective of who has access to the data because if they have the data, they already have the data, right? I can't undo knowing on that front. So I'm trying to keep some of our leadership at arm's length. And I don't like that necessarily. I would love for us to all sing Kumbaya and get along and them to be bought in and understand. But what we're doing is so important to maintain this positivity. We absolutely have to look at this and say, what I used to do, one of the things I used to talk to the custodians about is I would say, everybody has a phone in their pocket or they have a pedometer or a Fitbit or something. And I would say, how many steps do you get in a day? How many actual steps do you walk every day? And the custodians, some of them were walking 30, 35,000 steps in a day, and other custodians were walking 15 to 20. Well, the 15 to 20 you would think would come with lesser results because they're not covering as much area. But really, what it comes down to is how do you use this data to say, man, you're bouncing from this spot to that spot to this other spot, and you're backtracking multiple times. And if you look at the tracker and the dashboard, you could see just kind of the messy spider web of paths that somebody has taken, or you see somebody taking an incredibly clean path. They pick up their cart, they get all their stuff, they have all the things with them, they have all their supplies, and then they go room to room to room in a very systematic way. Um, and that's one way to just encourage them to, it's easier on their body, it's easier on them. They will feel better if they do it. Another piece is custodial work, especially when you're understaffed, especially when um, you're trying to solve more problems than you're capable of solving because you're just not resourced appropriately. It is to give them the sense of accomplishment. They don't necessarily get to see the dashboard and to see the dots turn from red to green and stuff like that, but they do get to scan the code and they do get to make a note and take a picture. And so one of the things that we're talking about and we're training them on is I want them to get the good feels and to essentially inoculate themselves against the people having a bad day, the people that were mean, the people that were upset, the things that got missed, because I want them to know that they are accomplishing good things. So, as we continue to push through this, we have this classroom that it's notorious, right? I could bring up the building, and everybody that's ever worked in that building knows exactly who I'm talking about. But this teacher would, it's at the first of one of our custodial runs. It's the second or third classroom that gets cleaned. And then this teacher notoriously comes back between like 8 and 9 o'clock at night, brings children, they make a mess, and then they complain that their classroom didn't get cleaned when they come to school the next morning and it looks the way that they had left it. So what I'm doing is I'm telling my custodial staff, this is a weapon or a shield. Probably a shield is a better way to say that you can fight back or you can protect yourself. And you can prove by taking a picture of it, you can scan the code, you can show them that it was done. And if somebody complains and I can pull it up in the system, I can say, no, it was done and this is what it looked like. And so whatever's going on is not an us problem, it's a them problem. And I don't like an us versus them situation. I want to be collaborative about it, but when people want to march into battle, sometimes you have to put up the shield and protect.
Right. It does need to be a collaborative problem because at the end of the day, like you said, it's about student outcomes and student education. It shouldn't be us versus them. It should be us trying to all solve that together. How do you how do you envision or how do you see the shielding or protecting and empowering of the custodians ultimately driving those academic outcomes and in impact? What's the tie there for?
So shielding the custodians, I think that kind of breaks down into the academic outcomes are going to come from having the better, cleaner buildings, the better air quality, the better environment, stuff that are not, it's just basically removing the distractions from the environment. If we do our job essentially, or if we do our job really well, um, essentially it should just exist and nobody should really notice anything about it, right? It should just exist. We're not a really high-end hotel or restaurant where we want to, you know, vacuum lines in the carpet or patterns in a very particular way or something like that. We just want it to exist. And so what I like about creating this data and leaning into this this dashboarding piece with Custodial is that it helps the custodians protect themselves on one front because they can say, I cleaned X number of square feet, and the head custodian or lead or whoever it is comes behind and says, yeah, our quality assurance checks are a three, and we have a rubric and we've built all of those things out. So then, if they're doing their job to a sufficient level at a reasonable expectation and things still aren't getting done, it's not the custodian's problem. And that's one of the things that I really struggle with on some of my good custodians. And I have a spectrum, right? I have really great custodians and I have not so great custodians, and we're always working to grow and build and whatnot. But my really great custodians will come in early off the clock. They will leave late off and be off the clock. They will do work when they're not supposed to do work. And I have to remind them that they, one, don't owe the school district that at all. And two, it's a liability for both them and the school district. And I have to build this in to say, just stop. Don't do that because I need the data to reflect reality so that whenever it's time, I can go to our superintendent's cabinet or the superintendent or whomever and say, this is where we're at now for our quality assurance. This is what it looks like, the reality of the situation. This is how much we're cleaning. If you want and these are our custodians, and we have, I can show them that spectrum of what that looks like. And I can say, if you want these quality assurance numbers to increase, we are going to have to increase our staffing because I don't want the custodians carrying this around with them at home and on the weekends and whatnot. They need to have some level. I want them to do great work when they're here. I want them to do the best work they can, but I don't want them to let this affect the rest of their life just because we're not set up for success.
You bring up an interesting point as you're talking about the data and making those decisions and not wanting it to impact the custodians' lives outside of work by really framing it as there's not good data or bad data, there's just data. And that's what we use to make the decisions, right? Like, you don't want to falsify things or chase numbers just to look good. You want to use it so that you can empower the best outcomes for your custodians and then therefore the students, right? I want to come back to that idea you mentioned earlier of not necessarily shooting for the ideal or the gold standard all of the time because we have to balance out all the finite amount of dollars that need to be spent on student experience and education and facilities as part of that. I have a couple of questions related to that. The first is, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but how do you defend this point of view and this philosophy um, to parents or the school board administration, each school administration, if they think it's not being done to their level, right? How do you help them understand that balance?
It's so we continually deal with these kind of tough conversations, tough problems. And I was in my HR director's office the other day, and one of the things that I told him is that I don't want the best custodial department. I don't want it to be this phenomenal, most amazing gold standard. And he really struggled with that. Like he's a very black and white person. He's a, very analytical person, but it's not something that you could tell it's the first time he'd ever even considered that that's not the goal. And what I tell people is, and I to use MBA buzzword is right sizing, you know? And so I don't I don't want I want our custodial department to function the way that it needs to function to basically manage the health and the safety of the kids in the buildings. And so we focus on bathrooms and health rooms above all else. Then we focus on getting the trash out of the building. Then we focus on doing the floors and cleaning and wiping down the surfaces. I think to tell people we don't want to be the best at this is very strange for them. And I think it comes from a um I don't know. It's almost like it's built into the fabric of our American culture is, well, if I'm not running a marathon, I'm not really a runner, right? If I'm not cycling hundreds of miles a week, I'm not really a cyclist. And it's like, well, wait a minute now. Where are you in your life? What's your resources look like? And, I'm not going to ask my 80, 79-year-old mother to run a marathon. It's just not going to happen. But I do want her to walk up and down the hallways a few times to make sure that she's getting exercise in. And it's reframing some of these items to allow them to then understand maybe this is the right way. And then I hit them with if it's just like balancing your checkbook, not that anybody, I guess, really does that anymore, but it's about making sure that you're not overspending in your bank account or whatever that happens to look like for you. It's knowing that 85% of the budget in a school is probably going to be spent on staffing. That's pretty normal across all K-12 institutions. And then subdividing that 85% out into how many teachers do we need? How much do they cost per person, per FTE? How much does a custodian cost? How much does each one of these things cost? Because if I can cut two custodial positions, I've now gained a teacher and a quarter, right? And if that reduces our class sizes and increases the educational outcomes, then that's what we need to do. But if we cut custodial beyond, if you're amputating limbs rather than, you know, doing an appropriate level of surgery or whatever we want to use for an analogy here, is that if the bathrooms are dirty, if the kids don't want to come, if they don't want to use the restroom, if we're getting kids sick because we're not able to maintain those spaces appropriately and our attendance rates drop, then we are the ones that are affecting those educational outcomes as much or more than the teachers. That's one of the things I wrote down from the previous presentation is that, increasing the indoor air quality is reducing class size by a third. Like that's yeah, and I know that's not exactly what she said, but I'm probably going to use it that way to make sure that people understand why we're doing, what we're doing is important. Um,
Yeah.
and making sure that we're using an appropriate vacuum cleaner with appropriate bags with appropriate filtration so that we can get the dust and the dirt and the grime out of the carpets as best as we can. And that, in the summers, we're shampooing all of our carpets and trying to get as much of that out of the building as possible. Because if you have an asthmatic child, if you have somebody that's allergic to dust mites, um, we don't want them to have a bad experience. And I think that, we haven't really touched on this one, but it's also if kids get sick when they go to school, which some of that is kids just get sick when they go to school because they have to build up their immunities to all of the different colds and whatever. And by the time they're in middle school, they don't get sick very often anymore. But we want parents to know and understand that this is the best place for their kids. We touched on that briefly. You asked the question about the research, but really what it comes down to is that we do have declining birth rates, and declining birth rates, based on my research during my data visualization course, they are correlated. I mean, if you're having fewer babies, you're having fewer kids in schools, but the R value is not high enough to say that that accounts for all of the story. Declining birth rates are a thing. Well, then if you start breaking these things apart and you start splitting it out, you realize that in Oklahoma, the only schools that are truly growing are virtual charter schools, private schools. And I don't have any problems with that. Anecdotally, I think parent choice is a thing and it should be honored in a lot of ways. But, whenever the public schools have been used to not being in competition with anybody for a long time. And now there's somebody else out there that's actively trying to take state funding away from us so they can run their own school. I just read an article yesterday that said that there's the first new 100% AI instruction school, is going to take place in Oklahoma. And that's terrifying in some ways, um, because I think we've gotten to the point where we don't value the interactions between the people and, how important playground time is for students and having to interact and learn is huge. So thinking about, how do you market this? And I have a really good friend of mine. He has a pre-K aged kiddo, and he's not sending them to Stillwater Public Schools because he just doesn't think he thinks that continuing this other program is going to be better for his child at this time. And I respect that decision, but I'd love for him to be able to make a different decision because I do think that the teachers that we have are excellent and that we are providing a great service to the students. Um, it's just not perfect all the time, you know, and we're under fire a lot from
Right.
anytime there's a misstep somewhere, that's what is in the news.
Right. Um, with that, as we start to come to a close of our conversation, this has been incredibly inspiring and enlightening. I think that you have really shared several nuggets that many of those listening will latch on to and kind of apply back to their situations. It is an unusual approach that you take, but it's one I think more school districts should take and focus in on to help solve these problems. I think you're having outsized results from taking a little bit different approach. So I want to thank you for that. We'll open things up to questions from the audience here in just a little bit. I did want to ask you one more question, which is, you know, we have a lot of administrators and facilities directors, superintendents, things like that listening in today. And I know your goal, especially in recently joining the NSPMA board, is to professionalize facilities management worldwide, make it more reputable, really bring in a lot of these learnings we have in higher education and academia and bring it back down to K through 12. Um, is your thinking about the upcoming school year in that frame? What's kind of your ultimate call to action for folks listening today as they plan out their strategies for the upcoming year?
So I want to share two things. I want to share one is the my personal mission is to professionalize it, like you mentioned, but also it's to provide new administrators, new facilities managers, a toolkit in the K-12 realm that is functional for them and hopefully nationwide. Um, to be able to give them something where if they're a member of an organization or they can pay kind of like the American Institute of Architects, the AIA documents for construction, if you buy into this and you need to stripe your parking lots, it'll be these are the requirements that you should ask of these people, and you just have to fill in the blanks for the locations and those types of things. That way we can get it to where, you know, you stripe parking lots. Well, every parking lot striping company in the country is going to want to do the schools because we have a lot of parking lots. Well, if we do it the right way, they just know what's expected of them, whether they're in Stillwater, Oklahoma or Stillwater, Minnesota. Um, and so, and that's for roof and HVAC and like all of the different things and being able to plug these components in and be able to go to the library and pull it up and not start from scratch every time like I did. That was frustrating and tiring. And the whole reason for this is to give you the bandwidth to focus on your staff and your people and the people that you lead and manage so that you can be an effective leader for them. Because at the end of the day, they have to turn around and do the work. And then they have to do the work at such a level that it fades into the background or it's supportive of the learning experience in the educational environment, because that's what's paramount. We're here to do what's best for the kids at every turn. And so, if that means that I'm going to go to battle against the CFO because, you know, I didn't get something approved correctly, I'll do it every single time and I'll say that it was the best thing for the kids. You can't have a playground without, substrate on it for impact resistance for any length of time because somebody's going to get hurt and it's not the right thing to do. And that's very empowering to me, is to hold that thing and to say and have that yardstick and say what's best for the people that work for me and what's best for the kids in the classroom. Because if I support the people and they know our goal is to support the kids in the classroom, the biggest problem that you'll have is trying to pull them back and say, you can't work 50 hours a week. You're burning yourself out. You can't do these things. You're doing too much. Slow down, pull back. And that's what I want is, sell people on the idea of sailing across the ocean and that they'll build your boat for you instead of telling them how to build the boat.
That's
Love
great.
it. I love
And
it.
I just wanted to jump in. We still have time for questions. Feel free to go over here. We have a break here, but definitely want to get to more
Sure.
questions as we have it. If you guys are still okay with going a little bit over.
I'm good. Yep.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
it looks like we do have a question in the chat about
Yeah, so one of the questions was around data collection and pictures being great shields for custodians. Did you have much pushback using a custodial personal phone for work? When you've talked to your staff.
so yes and no. And I think this is something that the crowd comfort group is very used to and they understand. You're going to have high emotion sometimes because people don't understand, and there's going to be pushback and there's going to be people that are upset and whatnot. Um, I implemented this across my 40 45 custodians right now, and I had three people just flat out refuse to use their personal device. So the strategy on that for me is the best device that I can really purchase is an iPad mini, um, because it's the smallest form factor that really works with the unit, and I'm not going to go out and buy cell phones for the form factor and then disable the data plans and do all that. Like it just doesn't make any sense. And so the cost and the value is you buy the iPad mini, you put a case on it, you put a lanyard on it, it attaches to a cart, something like that. And so I bought a pack of 10 because that's one of the units that you can buy them in from Apple. And then um, just if they don't want to use their own personal device, they can use the iPad mini. But also I was in IT for a long time. And so that iPad mini only does their mandatory annual training and crowd comfort. There is no anything else on that device for them to do well, and the camera. So it doesn't do anything for them. They're not gaining anything from it. And then the other piece is that it's bigger than a regular cell phone. It does not fit in your pocket. And what I've found is that most of our custodians, they like a couple of things. They like using their phone because it'll fit in their pocket. and B, they like to have an excuse to be able to touch their phone during their shift because they're taking their pictures. And if they take their picture, they scan that QR code and they take the photograph, they have their phone in their hand for 30 seconds and they can check a message, flip music, do whatever. Another thing that we do is that I do allow my custodians, they can have one earbud or one headphone on at any given point in time because that's for housekeeping purposes in the evenings. I don't see any reason why somebody couldn't listen to an audiobook and wipe down tables or clean a bathroom or listen to music or even on some of our staff they use a body doubling technique. So I'll find out that custodian A is talking to custodian B and they're just both cleaning the whole time, and it's an ADHD management technique. And so far be it for me if that helps them be more successful and they're able to get their scans and do their work and it's of a sufficient quality. Sure, let's do it.
Love it. Got one more question for you, and that is, what is the best first step that folks can take today toward changing and doing things differently?
I would say the problem is the first step only leads to the next 50 steps, right? So what I recommend to people is you need to map out the responsibilities and you need to start generating the data to even know what direction to run in, to know what problems you have. Because if you're just the problem is if you're using your email or phone calls of complaints or some other thing to manage what you're doing, you will be able to do that up to a certain point, but you'll never be able to reach your own standards. And so you need to figure out what your data looks like, and then you need to figure out what your standards need to be. So that way you know where you are and you know where you're going. And then you start to figure out how to put the pieces in place, build your team.
Incredible. Incredible. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the time, wisdom, uh, the house analogies, the boat building, all of it. It's just been a treat.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Rob, I want to thank you as well. And you're an incredible thought leader in this space. And I know you're somewhat new to the role you're in, but you've really brought some incredible new innovation and thinking to the role. So thank you, and thank you for sharing that with us.
I appreciate it.
Great. Well, Rob, thank you. I appreciate it, Gailey, as well for leading that discussion. We'll get started kind of in the next presentation, which will be my presentation. So we'll get started in that in a few minutes here. Did also want to do kind of a shout out to all our previous presenters. FMX, our sponsor for this event, which will be speaking after me. As well as Sarah Porter on Healthy Green Schools. Definitely check out their website and all the content and their assessments as you're moving forward. So, Rob and Gail, you guys can jump off and we'll get started in a bit here, but thank you so much. Fantastic. So just to give us a quick breather and probably a minute here, I will get started on our next session. So our next session will be on kind of some of the data around enrollments and budgets and the latest, greatest there. And we'll get started here in just a few minutes.